Hello everybody and happy Memorial Day. This is the second video I've made today because the first one didn't work for some reason, but such is online teaching. I'm sure it'll happen again. So excellent job with your assignments and thank you for handing those in. I've also fixed the timestamp issue, so thank you for alerting me to that. So 11:59 EST really is 11:59 Eastern Standard Time, so you don't need to worry about that. Now also this week we're going to begin commenting on each other's work. Each student has to submit 3 comments a week on another student's work, or 3 different students' work. Now you can go about this in several different ways. You might want to comment on those people who did the same assignment as you, and you might want to say, you might want to ask them to expand on their arguments a little bit. You might want to bring something new to the table. You might take issue with something they've said and seek to challenge it, obviously in a respectful manner. Or perhaps you want to comment on that work that's very different from yours. Maybe something piqued your interest. Maybe you have something to bring to the table. Maybe you can expand the argument in some ways, or open up an element of it that the author hadn't originally considered. Okay, remember that your comments have to be substantive and they have to be well thought out. They have to be clearly articulated, and they need to bring something new to the discussion. It's just like as if you were going to respond to somebody's presentation in class, and so please make them intelligent, maintain decorum and social etiquette, and keep going. Also, one thing to bear in mind, there's always going to be a kind of a time lag. So if you start your comments this week, you're going to be commenting on the work that people submitted last week. Next week, you're going to be commenting on the work that people submitted this week, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so on to this week's topic. Now, last week we discussed the concept of what is criticism and how are we going to insert ourselves into this discussion between art on the one hand and society on the other. And what I wanted to draw your attention to was how important it is for us to have self-awareness as critics and to understand kind of where we are coming from and what preconceptions and prejudices we bring to the act of criticism. Now, prejudice is such an ugly word in our society, and in its most malignant form it means bigotry and discrimination. But also prejudice quite literally means to prejudge something. And we can prejudge all kinds of little things, quite innocent and benign things, as well as, ugly and socially corrosive things. And those prejudgments stem from our experience. They stem from our gender, our age, our education, our social background, what kind of demographic we are from, our race, our ethnicity, our religious affiliation. And all those things come together and accumulate to formulate the kind of subject, our identity, and the subject position we will take in relation to other things. Now, one of the first things we need to do as critics is be aware of all that, be aware of the baggage that we carry and the preconceptions we'll bring with us, so that when somebody says, this text means X, it's obvious, it's common sense, we can say, well, whose common sense? And whose common sense are you giving primacy and authority to here? Whose common sense are you allowing to speak on my behalf? Well, maybe your common sense and my common sense are kind of different things, because I understand that, we have come at these positions from very different directions, and so we need to be aware of that in the conversation. I asked you also to look at John Berger's groovy 1970s TV show Ways of Seeing, because I think it's a really excellent example of how to deepen the critical conversation, because John Berger asks us to look again at many works of art which we've been told are masterpieces. Now, being told something is a masterpiece is one of the most superficial forms of criticism there can be, because as soon as you're told something is a masterpiece, then it shuts down the conversation. It's just, all you need to know about this is it's a masterpiece. That's all there is to say. Well, maybe we want to go a bit deeper. Maybe we want to know a little bit more, right? And so what John Berger does is he shows us how, by reinserting works of art, famous works of art, into their historical, their political, and their cultural contexts, they can reveal much more than just this pure world of aesthetic ideation. They can actually begin to tell us about the culture that produced them. So, when we look at female nudes, for example, they begin to say a great deal about the dynamic of the gender relations between men and women, say in the 17th or 18th century. Similarly, when we look at landscape painting, we can see this concept of dominion and landowning that the moneyed landed classes would have. They would lay the land out for them so that they could survey it. This sense of ownership that then supports politically justifies the hierarchy and the position of the people in authority, right? So we want to kind of reintroduce these concepts so that we can begin to read the ideology of at work in art, whether it be literary texts or visual images. So over the next 5 weeks, now that we've kind of developed this idea of a kind of self-awareness of where we are and where our critical positions come from, over the next 5 weeks we're going to be introduced to a series of methodologies that help us leverage our criticism, give us a series of perspectives that will allow us to find rich content in the literary texts that we look at, and will allow us to kind of shine light into otherwise obscure corners and find new and interesting things in the text we read. So this week we're going to begin with structuralism and post-structuralism. Now, structuralism really begins with the insight that language is an arbitrary system, which is to say that the words we use for things are not anchored in any thingness of the thing, right? There's no reason why dog, the word dog, and the animal that it refers to are sort of linked in some sort of essential way. There's no dogness of the word dog, right? Rather, it's just a sound I can make with my mouth that in English we've all agreed designates the man's best friend, right? So what structuralism begins with is this idea of kind of loosening language from this anchor that has always we've always taken it for granted that language has had some concrete meaning somewhere in the external world. Structuralism begins through the insights of the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure to start to kind of undo these ties and start to say, well, maybe language is actually just this kind of arbitrary system, this self-contained but arbitrary system that we've all consensually agreed more or less does the job of explaining the reality we find ourselves in and the experiences we have. However, sometimes it also fails to grasp them in their entirety, and actually that failure to grasp experience in its entirety is probably why we have things like music, art, and poetry, right? Because they try and fill in that gap between pure explanation of emotional states and the failure to purely explain the emotional state. So, having undermined this tie between language and reality, structuralism then comes in as a kind of quasi-scientific mode of trying to explain how there are in fact a series of prefabricated social structures or social mythologies that we use to try and explain the world around us, right? Just as language is this kind of arbitrary system of science, maybe culture itself has been kind of founded on a series of preconceptions, right? A series of narratives that seek to explain the experience and the world around us. Maybe there's nothing sort of genuinely authentic about the way that we experience the world. Perhaps it's just this kind of consensually agreed series of narrative tricks. So, having done that, we then move on to post-structuralism, which says, well, obviously, if all language is ultimately arbitrary, then all attempts to explain it through structure must be arbitrary too, because what do structures rely on, if not language, in order to find their articulation? And so it goes on from there. Now, it can get quite complicated. So what I want you to do is, there's a lot of reading this week. What I want you to do is throw yourself into the reading as soon as you can. Email me if you have any questions about any of this, and then begin to think about the relationship between structure, language, and culture. Okay, and best of luck.